do. What is it that drew you to investigative journalism in your early years? Do you want to take us back to when you started as a journalist?
Yeah. Look, almost all journalists now enter the profession or the craft, as some people call it, with a tertiary education. They've been to university, they've been schooled in all sorts of things that when I left high school in at the end of 1984 on the Gold Coast, I didn't understand. And when I started at the Gold Coast Bulletin as a copy boy with the promise of a cadetship if I didn't screw up in the first 6 or 9 months as copy boy. I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to be a reporter covering general news and you know police incidents, maybe even serious crimes. Whatever was happening in my community. I didn't properly appreciate or understand the potential with investigative journalism, but I credit my mum and my dad in particular. I can still remember being a teenager. I'd recently become a cadet and I was working in the sports section of the Gold Coast Bulletin because they probably thought that's where I should start. I had a keen interest in sport, and my old high school where Chris Dawson taught was powering in rugby league, and they'd become newsworthy. My school of Keebra Park State High, and Dad said, "Oh, pal, when do you think you might think about investigative journalism?" It just seemed like such a faraway thing, it's this um, almost unattainable um, ideal, and um, so typical of my dad to sort of raise the bar a little bit higher. I was just glad the job as a journo, and here he was saying, "Well, when are you going to be like Chris Masters?" But it was a very fortuitous time to become a journalist in Queensland in the 1980s, because what we saw in the second half of the 80s was some incredible investigative journalism by Chris Masters and by Phil Dickey from the Courier Mail. And it just, whether you were intending to sort of take lessons from it or not, it must have influenced so many young reporters. It certainly influenced me uh, in realizing that for many years, our our criminal justice system had been completely bent. Our senior police, all the way up to the commissioner, Sir Terence Lewis, a knight, was on the take. They were on the take, stealing money from the community, being paid bribes by brothel owners and casino operators and all sorts of, shadowy criminals. And we had always suspected this, I think, as a community, but no really serious journalism had exposed it until they came along. And that those events, uh, they have to have influenced a generation of young journalists to no longer just accept um, the trotted out spin and lies of um, government officials and ministers and other people in authority.
It seems like with this case in particular, the Chris Dawson case, given there was no body, there was no admission from Chris, and there was no real DNA evidence, clothing, blood, of anything of that nature. So it's quite a massive landmark case in the history of Australia and investigative journalism. Do you understand, I guess, the responsibility that you have as a journalist and the role you have to play now, and I guess the way that these cases proceed moving forward, and what such an influence you've had in the landscape in Australia, but also across the world, given how broad and far wide the podcast spread?
Yeah, I do feel a burden of responsibility there, and I think that um, it's a a privilege and honor as well as a bit of a weight. It depends on who you talk to, though, in terms of my role in the investigation of Chris Dawson and the influence of the teacher's pet. A lot of fair-minded lawyers and judges and retired judges, for example, and we're talking now about representatives of the criminal justice system, they acknowledge to me, as well as senior police, they acknowledge this too, that if it hadn't been for the podcast, there wouldn't have been, in their view, a conviction, perhaps not even a prosecution proceeding. But then you get others who say, oh, yeah, but his podcast and the way he, took the way he spoke to so many witnesses who would have been key witnesses for the Crown, that almost blew the whole thing up. He could have ruined it. He almost did ruin it. It was lucky that it proceeded the way it did. So you get this kind of, division in terms of the way my role is perceived. I think the listenership and most people who are not lawyers and who just, use their common sense and look at, what happened, the chronology of events and so on, they have a view that there wouldn't have been a prosecution and that it took the teacher's pet to really jolt the system to do the right thing after letting Lynn down for so many years. But I am aware that it's not universal.